Welcome to this session of the Courageous Leadership Academy Live. I'm your host, Dr. Kelly Waltman. And if you're new to this series, we talk about all things leadership. We focus a lot on communication, but we really delve into all things, leadership, business ownership, really just to help you be a better leader and often just a better human. And my guest today is no exception to this series in conversations and helping us be, just better at what we do. My guest today is Paul McCarthy. He is the CEO and Chief Fired Officer. Can't wait to talk about this. Of Fired Leadership. He is driven by the quest to discover what motivates people to do what they do, what we do. And he strives to create the conditions for leaders of all levels to have courageous and honest conversations that build strong and healthy organizations. Like I said, right up our alley for this series. Having worked within big firms in the UK and Canada, he brings global perspective to his work. And he has lots of real-world experience as well as a leader. And his background in anthropology, sociology, and social policy create a natural curiosity about culture, social structure, and how that informs and shapes corporate systems. And he's quickly becoming a key influencer of how future leaders are shaping future workplaces. And he passionately provides mentorship to the next generation of young entrepreneurs and future leaders through collaboration with nonprofit organizations, or simply over a cup of Earl Grey. Personally, I prefer Irish breakfast tea, but we won't hold that against Paul. It's all good. And we also will get to hear a little bit about how he's using this time with COVID to be a digital nomad and have some great experiences. So without further ado, let's bring Paul into the broadcast. Hello, Paul, and welcome.
Kelly, hi. I do also prefer Irish breakfast tea as well. So we're on the same page there. Anything that's either Scottish, Irish, or English is a good combination. So thank you for having me here.
All right. Yes. Well, you're redeemed then. I think Earl Grey is the only tea I don't like.
Well, we can have another conversation about that. I'm sure.
We can, yes. We'll save that for another day. So yes, thank you so much. I like to offer up to my guests before we really dive into things. Is there anything else that you would like to share by way of an introduction?
Well, I think it's important to kind of, straight off the bat to whoever's listening to this, who joins live or listens to it after the fact, that the work that I'm doing isn't the result of some bitter and twisted or jaded leader who's been fired and wants to get his own back on the system. What it is, it's a distillation of almost a quarter of a century of working in leadership development in terms of every part of the process end to end, as well as being a leader and having my expertise as leadership development for practitioners and clients. And so what I'm doing, I love the nature of your session, because you talk about courageous and having courageous conversations. And really, I just decided it was time. I'd had enough, and it was time to come out off the sidelines and talk about a conversation and a topic that very few of us want to have. So for anyone listening, this is not a tirade against corporate systems. This is not a gripe fest against anyone that had fired me, as we'll later find out what my story is, or an attempt to kind of get famous in this era of digital thought leadership and everyone calling themselves gurus. It's nothing like that. So as this conversation unfolds, it really is about creating the conditions for honest, meaningful, courageous, and forward-looking dialogue about a subject that we've hidden under the stairs for too long. So that's what I would just couch this in the context of, for anyone listening who's thinking this guy's just bitter and twisted, because actually my experience as being fired as a leader is probably the most celebrated thing in my professional career. So
yeah. I love everything about that. I love, like you talked about, creating that space for that open dialogue. Some of our, what people might think of as quote unquote negative experiences in our lives can actually be some of the most powerful and empowering experiences in our lives. And so I love that you couch the conversation we're about to have with that framework or with that lens. I think that's really important.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it speaks to one of the things you said in your kind of promotion of this with the social media thumbnails that we saw, which is about shifting narrative and having a paradigm shift and change in the way that we look at a conversation like this. And I think it really is about creating those conditions to have that narrative. And whatever comes up in that, it's not going to be painless. Let me just be very clear in the work that I'm doing. It's very painful. It adds grey hairs to my head every day, but it needs to happen. It really needs to happen. So
yeah. No, that's great. So you kind of alluded to as you're framing our conversation that you've had the experience of being fired. So why don't you share your story with us? Share your journey with that. What was the kind of the impetus and what led you to form Fired Leadership? Talk to us about your journey.
Yeah, and I know we were speaking off backstage on this about like you and I both go out and do a lot of podcasts and talk about our quests quite regularly, and to me I'm sounding like a broken record, but to the world I'm meeting new people and exciting people every day. It's phenomenal. I can't believe what's happening. But yeah, my story started, I'm obviously from the UK, and I've been in the consulting world and leadership development world, as I said, for about 25 years. And as I've gone through my career, those in the consulting industry will definitely know what I'm talking about here. You rise the ranks, you progressively get more senior, you take on more responsibilities, and all of a sudden you're in a leadership position in a consulting firm. And so my speciality was being a leadership development, human capital guy with clients that these consulting firms would farm me out to support, very high profile client names, etc. And my job was to help provide leadership development to those organizations, different levels of leaders, and prepare them for the future. And as a leader, I was also brought in as a leader in these consulting firms to build businesses, practices, functions, departments. And so I had the role of a leader growing a business as well as providing leadership development to clients. Right. And I've been in Canada for about 10 years now, and I've been fired 4 times from organizations in Canada. And so I started to think to myself, well, why is that and what's happening? Because I was going through, and again, anyone listening to me after the fact or live will know that I talk about this quite as a regular, feature of my story. But I'd gone through very lengthy and time-consuming interview processes, often averaging between 6 and 9 per role. And I went through these processes, and I met some great people along the way, and I consistently demonstrated the qualities that would ultimately get me hired. And then once I got into the role and started to kind of get my feet under the table, spread my wings, everything like that, I would begin demonstrating these qualities. And these qualities, again, they were looked for as part of these lengthy, time-consuming and expensive recruitment processes. And when I started demonstrating them, I started getting in trouble, Kelly. Right. I started getting my hands slapped, or I was left out of meetings, or there was a meeting before the meeting and I wasn't invited. And I started to kind of put together some thoughts around this, and I thought, well, I had no idea what's happening. So essentially, the things that got me hired would ultimately get me blacklisted and also fired. Right. And this happened, once you could think, okay, it's bad luck, just kind of move on, massage your resume. Right. Then it happened again. And then again, and then again. And by the way, this was 2 major global consulting firms, as well as a boutique consulting firm, and also a tech startup that I was building with some other talented guys. And so I sat around after this happened, and on the 4th time, and I thought to myself, I am the common denominator, aren't I? Right? I'm just difficult to work with. Does nobody really want to work with me? And am I full of crap? Pardon my euphemism. But then I started to get curious, because again, part of my role was to also stay on top of leadership development trends and the horizon and what was coming. And this was, by the way, everything I'm talking about that formed what I'm going to mention that it formed was about 4 years ago. So pre the most wide-scale disruption that we're experiencing because of the C word right now, right? So I started quite literally, I went into a windowless room in a basement, ate some pizza, played some ping pong, and started reflecting on the reasons why I'd been fired. And I kept on coming up with the same themes every time in every role. And for me, they were, I was hired to challenge. So I was hired to disrupt and upset conventional thinking. I was hired for that never-ending curiosity that I have, which is always unearth every idea behind every stone and don't accept the surface level answer. I was hired because I said that I wouldn't play the corporate political game, that I would be real, that we would do what I say. There's a paint, I think it's in the UK, called Ronseal, and I was hired because I did what it said on the tin, right? And that was Ronseal's slogan. I was hired because I would challenge things, and I wouldn't accept the first answer, and I wouldn't defer to hierarchy. And I was very direct in this as well. And I didn't play that game, and I was transparent. I never had an agenda, never wore a mask. Was what you saw was what you got.
Right.
And those things I demonstrated in the leader recruitment processes every single time. And so when I started to pontificate and wonder, well, why am I being fired? These were the things that came up. So the idea, what I then literally did was say, I looked for words to denote what these experiences meant. And they came out as things like innovation, challenger, accountability, authentic, transparent. And this is in my first of 3 books as well. I go into a lot more detail. But then what I did was I said, what are some synonyms for these 5 things?
Right.
And I quite literally scoured through hundreds and hundreds of different synonyms. If you've ever done that, there's a synonym for a synonym, right? And
yes.
So
it's a rabbit hole that you could totally get lost in, for sure.
Yeah. And I did. And I had no idea, Kelly, what I was doing. I just was really curious about why I'd been fired. So when the world, family, friends, former romantic partners were saying, you're just too difficult to work with, and your leadership style, they would say things like it's ahead of its time, or you upset people. And I took all that very seriously, because it's also a self-reflective experience, and to have the ability to have courageous conversations, you've got to go deep and you've got to go internal. And there's some stuff that surfaced that I didn't like, but in true consultant fashion, I accepted it. And then I came up with basically this acronym: fresh thinking, inquisitive nature, real and accountable, expressive and challenging, and direct and transparent. It spelled fired. And these were the 5 qualities that would later form the actual foundation for fired leadership. So then I got really curious, and I started to think, I wonder if we're firing top talent for having these qualities that I think we need for the future, and how we navigate disruption. So then I went even further. Again, everybody thought I was crazy. I went further than this, and I said, I wonder if these 5 things feature in the way we develop leaders now. And I figured, I went through quite a few hundred different leadership development programs, some that I developed, some from, INSEAD and Wharton and some high profile schools.
Right.
And guess what? They're not there. No. They're not there. And so I thought, oh my word, what have I landed on? And basically I started to think about how could we reshape the narrative and shift the narrative to having this conversation, so that we can create the conditions to look at the way we fire leaders for these qualities in a different way. And that's what started my path, Kelly. And so what I realized is, inadvertently, in all of that process of getting fired, I had exposed things like leadership dysfunction, the hypocrisy of leadership, ego-based leadership, rising levels of toxicity, the political beast that being a leader in a corporate setting requires, in fact, demands of people. And all of this dysfunction has led to a higher level of disengagement. And so that also, I started getting curious about that. And that's when this whole hypothesis formed into what it is now and what it's becoming.
Yeah. Anecdotally, because this specifically is obviously not my area of focus, but anecdotally, I can absolutely see what you're talking about. And even if leaders aren't being outrightly fired, as you say, and some likely are, but even if they're not being outrightly let go, as you said, they're being blacklisted, they're being excluded from meetings, they're being shut down in meetings. And so even if they remain in that workspace, they're technically being fired, really, because they're not allowed to engage to their fullest capacity. They're not being allowed to do their job. Those personality traits and those qualities that you talked about, being inquisitive and challenging, and everybody says they want those in leaders. Oh, we want people that are willing to challenge the status quo. We want people who are willing to, give us open feedback. We want that. We want to innovate. But when the rubber meets the road and you're actually having those types of conversations, and you are that person that is saying to leadership, well, wait a minute, I thought we wanted to do something different here, or I don't think this is really our best option, or I think maybe the way you're having that conversation with this other employee or this stakeholder is not the most beneficial way to have that, or maybe it's outright inappropriate. If you are the person that's doing that, very quickly in most environments, you're probably going to be shut down or silenced and pushed out. I can absolutely see that.
Well, and therein lies, Kelly, the hypocrisy.
Yeah.
And if you do a quick Google search, you won't find any book that's titled The Hypocrisy of Leadership. You won't find any reference to the hypocrisy of leadership. Now, I'm really thankful that this movement has started, because there are others that have come out of the woodwork and have done great work in rebellious and disruptive qualities that leaders need to actually keep their organizations ahead of the curve and more competitive than their peers. And, Francesca Gino's work with Rebel Talent, Lois Kelly, there's other work out of the US, a book called Rare Breeds by Sonny Bonnell, I believe, and there's others. And so I've started immersing myself in a different world. And for me, the future, the hypothesis is, what do we need for the future? And are we prepared to continue having the conversations where we're skirting around the hypocrisy? I mean, I can throw out all the stats and facts, but again, at the start, when I clarified, this isn't the efforts of a twisted and bitter leader that's been fired. This is the quest and the movement of someone that says, we spend almost $400 billion every year on leadership development.
Right.
When I tell you the next statistic, your eyes will probably, you'll be more alert, because only 14% of those surveyed in the largest global survey about leadership development and its effectiveness considered that leadership development was effective. So think about it. We're increasing leadership development investment, and we're having an increase in the number of people that don't find it effective.
Right.
So, and just as an anecdotal story, I won't name the client, but I was having these conversations like 10 years ago as a leader when I went in to talk to C-suite clients, and I asked the question of one client that had a significant investment in leadership development for its organization across the province. I won't name it, but I asked a simple question of the CEO. So you spend millions every year on leadership development. Can you show me the ROI, the return on investment for that investment, in terms of how it manifests in behavior change and the ability to do your job as a leader more effectively?
Right.
The response I got told me everything, and that wasn't in place. And then more importantly as well for this conversation, what happened afterwards was that particular CEO went to the partner in the consulting firm I was at the time and said, I don't want to speak to Paul again. He's asked me too many difficult questions. Now, the irony of this is I went into this organization as a client to redesign their organization. So I had to ask difficult questions, because they're the ones that we don't want to ask or answer are the ones where the solutions lie. Absolutely. And so, and I can reel off more statistics around from HBR and others that showcase that we are not getting the maximum return from the investment that we're making. So my quest isn't just about leadership development. It's about reframing the narrative around leadership identification, recruitment, onboarding, development, exit, right? Yeah. That whole end-to-end process is riddled with dysfunction, riddled with toxicity. quickly. So that's kind of my path is also to reframe how we see rebellious and disruptive leaders,
right?
From being that kind of disturber to someone that actually cares and has an aligned purpose with your organization to move it forward so that it can be the best it can be.
Right.
And all it takes is a quick shift of mindset.
Right. Well, and I think, that's a key piece there is, and we can talk a little bit more about some of the things that are missing from leadership development and what needs to be there. But it's one thing to say, okay, we recognize that future leaders need to have these skill sets and we need to shift the narrative and shift the curricula for leadership development to address these competencies. But we still have to shift the narrative and paradigm within the corporate structure, because if we're teaching and training leaders to have these competencies, but that culture is still toxic and is not willing to embrace it, there's going to be at least this period of time where you're going to have this this conflict, this continued hypocrisy and conflict. And so until those future leaders become truly the leaders, we have this in-between kind of leadership purgatory that we need to really work on addressing that narrative. And I think that's a big, it's important and it's essential, but that's a big task.
Yeah, there's a couple of points that you made. If I can just go back to the competency.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What I'm about to say, I can imagine that my head will be called for on a spike by the leadership development, learning and development industry, but it's true. Regardless of what I'm about to say, it's true. The competency model is dying, and so RIP, because those that haven't realized it are about to wake up to a very startling realization, is that the competency model and the framework, however nicely you've designed the visuals and it's so, I've done it hundreds of times, it dons the walls of lots of C-suite that I've worked with. It isn't worth the paper it's written on, right? And you charge, consulting firms charge millions for it. But here's the truth. The competency model, no one really wants to accept this. Its aim is about standardization and simplification.
Right.
What it doesn't do is it doesn't ask the learner, at whatever level they are, what they want to learn. They have a prescribed learning pathway, which they don't really have a choice in choosing what they want to learn, right? Firstly. Secondly, they're then given this pathway because it's standardized and simplified, because they can then get data, right, from that. But it all serves the corporate. It doesn't serve the learner or the leader. The leader is then not even asked how they want their measure, their performance, their kind of the way they apply the learning to be evaluated. So they're not involved in the development of the KPIs or measurements of success. They're given a bunch of KPIs. So think about it. You turn up at a restaurant and you want to have pizza, but you're given Chinese food. You don't get a choice, and you're told you have to eat it within a certain time frame. Right. But you wanted to have a pizza and you wanted to eat it over 4 hours. Right. This is exactly, and I've just made that up on the spot, but this is exactly the same. Yeah. This is exactly the same process that we're using to develop leaders. Now, I can tell you again right now that millennial leaders and those that are coming after, they're not interested in that. Gone are the days where we're going to get a bunch of leaders into a room for 5 days at an offsite where you only check your email at the breaks, right? Mm-hmm. When did that ever happen anyway? They're always checking their email. So that tells me they're checked out of the learning anyway, because it's not relevant to what their needs are. Right. And so what we're going to have is more tailored learning based upon the roles that leader fulfills. They're going to be much more engaged in measuring their own performance, and it's going to become much more learner-centric and driven. Now, again, welcome anyone in this conversation or after the fact challenge me on this, but I can show the data, I can show the groundswell and the shift that's happening, that we're moving away from a competency model to a quality-driven model. Right. So we can talk about skills, competencies, traits, qualities. The key distinction is to involve the leader in what they want to learn.
Right.
Every time. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing you talked about, which was really interesting, around leadership purgatory. I might even kind of leverage that in some way.
Yeah, I just came up with right then.
Love it. Great trademark. but there is an old school and there is a new school of leadership, leader kind of paradigm and thinking. And so, the narrative in the corporate environment is still one of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Right. And so, but it is broken. And so with the rise of, COVID, it's been great to hear more things around, authenticity, transparency, human-based leadership, heart-based leadership. I love it. Right. However, we still have a point in our evolution with corporate environments where I call it the 3 data points, and I write about it in the book as well. The first is, you go into any leader's office and you see a nice 1-page laminate on the wall with their values, their behaviors, the key buzzwords, right? Great, fantastic. I've developed them for them, right? And probably you have as well, and others, right? And we've benefited immensely from that. Right. The second data point is you see all the bunch of the books on their shelves, the Jim Collins, the Patrick Lencioni's, a bunch of gurus. Don't even get me started on that conversation. Anyone that can call themselves a guru has missed the point. But you see the books. And then the third data point is you see the way they lead. And what I've found by working with hundreds of leaders, maybe it's just my bad luck, but maybe it's also from the research corroborating this, is there's a complete incongruence between those 3 data points.
Right.
Now, why is that? And so until we actually have the courage, which again is the focus of this conversation and what you do with these sessions, until we have the courage to actually have that conversation, my fear is that we're just going to put a different shade of lipstick on the same pig.
Right.
So, rather than shift the deck chairs on the Titanic, let's realize the Titanic is about to sink, and let's think about what our next plan is. And that's what I'm trying to do. So to that question you are, or that kind of, how does one prepare for this when we still have a foot in the old camp, but we know the new's coming? Well, it's quite simple. It's be open to a conversation. That's all it takes. No fancy consultant charging you millions of dollars. It's just be open to a conversation.
Right. Yeah. Sounds so simple. Yeah. It is simple. It's just not easy. Yeah.
If we get out of our own way, it would be a lot simpler. But we have created a system of corporate structures that are infected with the need to play the game and rise the ranks and climb that greasy pole. And the other thing that's coming, which some might roll their eyes at and say it will never happen, but we thought that about COVID, didn't we? Is the fact that the rise of the self-managing organizational structure. So this, in a nutshell, is changing the way that we structure organizations from matrix-driven, draconian, hierarchical to flatter structures. Now, I've talked about this for those who know me at length, and I talk about it in my work in the book around Frederick Laloux's teal-based organizations, no hierarchy. In theory, that it should eradicate politics, leader-level turf wars, stuff like that. I have my own views on that, which again we could fill another hour, I'm sure with. But that's coming anyway, and there are some very successful organizations that dwarf a lot of the corporates that we've worked with in terms of their revenue generation and profits that have adopted the self-managing structures. Patagonia, Gore-Tex, Morning Star, the Hire Group out of China, Buurtzorg, the healthcare organization in the Netherlands. These are all massive organizations, and they are choosing to adopt different ways of structuring the organization, which actually address the idea that we have a foot in the old camp and the new. So because it provides the conditions to have that conversation.
Right. Well, and I would think that it makes it easier to implement something like that. Again, I use easy, but easier to implement something like that when you as an organization have very clearly defined priorities, when you know the things that are important to you, and they aren't things like hierarchy. They aren't things like, these traditional, as you say, draconian priorities that we're so worried about, what's on my nameplate and where I sit on the org chart. but I'm really concerned about the organization's priorities, and those are clearly defined. I would think that would help. And you wrote a little about this in one of your blog posts, the importance of leaders to clearly define their priorities. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. And for me, well, one of a startling set of facts that I uncovered for the research for my first book was that in thousands of organizations surveyed, a very small percentage of them actually ever have a defined leadership strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And of those that don't, or sorry, those that do, an even smaller number actually have leadership development programs and priorities that align to that strategy.
Right.
So the leadership strategy is the second variable that is informed and shaped by your business strategy, right? Which in any organization, the CEO needs to commandeer and champion. So think about it. Most organizations surveyed in the largest survey about leadership development don't have a leadership strategy. So therefore, the way they're developing leaders does not align to a strategy, which then aligns to the business strategy. Right. So it makes that question I asked that CEO a few years ago even more important, right? Because you're throwing money down a black hole.
Right.
You can't map its effectiveness back to your business strategy or priorities. So that's the I'm just couching it in that context before I now answer a little bit more micro level. But for me, having priorities as a leader comes back, like, put the macro bit to the side. As a leader, it comes down to knowing what you stand for as a leader. What is your purpose? Like, why are you in the organization? And an amazing amount of research is also surfacing that shows, let's say I join your organization and my purpose does not align to the organization's purpose, then the chances of me leaving your organization, or indeed not even joining, are much higher. So again, this is another thing that's coming that we need to stop rolling our eyes at as part of hiring managers and HR and leadership development, and start encompassing and saying, if I don't see myself in your organization, because by the way, millennial leaders, this is what's driving their decisions for recruitment, retention, right? And again, this is indisputable. So for me, the priorities stem from what the purpose is that you have as a leader. Know what you stand for, and make your priorities based upon that and the connection between the organizations, and have a conversation. In research that I've been doing around leadership onboarding and orientation, the majority of onboarding and orientation for leaders only focuses on things like, getting your swipe card, getting your HR details completed. It doesn't focus on sitting down with you, assigning a coach to you to understand your priorities, to then that coach helps you to map those priorities to the organizations, or indeed your role priorities. So we need a complete overhaul of that system in order for the role of priorities to be really well prioritized, right? So and then if I could just add on to the end of that, in theory, the performance assessment, performance evaluation process should have an end-to-end visibility of what those priorities are. And at the end of the year, when those leaders are evaluated, they need to be evaluated on their priorities. Unfortunately, that's not the case with the majority of organizations. We're looking at how much they played the game, how many boxes did they tick. We're not looking at whether or not they themselves delivered against their priorities as a leader, and how they felt about that in terms of the organization. So again, a complete seismic shift, but so simple to have, really, but just by shifting your lens. So that's what I mean when I talk about priorities.
Yeah, I love that. I have speaking of sharing stories, I have a story from an annual performance appraisal that fits in with this conversation very well. We haven't shared this with many people. Certainly not.
You're sharing it live now.
Yeah, but I tend to be one of those people as well, that we talked about earlier, where I'm going to I love to innovate. I love to problem solve. I love to have open and honest dialogue and give feedback and be candid. If I don't think something's going to work, and I'm very open to talking through how we can make it work. But I am one of those people, like all those qualities you talked about earlier, that tends to be me. And I was in a toxic work environment that did not appreciate that behavior. And essentially, at my one performance appraisal in my it was a standardized form, that all of HR used. In the section for how is that word? It's something about areas for growth and improvement over the next year. Basically, it was to be a better yes girl. Was essentially, that wasn't the exact wording, but it was to basically to do a better job at being the type of employee that, and essentially it was to be a better yes girl. And I thought, I can think of a lot of areas of where I could grow and improve as a leader and as an employee and as a team member. I'm not saying I don't have room for growth. We all do. And I could give a list of things that I would have gladly seen on there. But to basically be a better yes girl, that's my area for growth and improvement for the next year. Yeah, it was shocking.
and that is thank you for sharing, by the way. Thank you.
Yeah.
For vulnerable and courageous to share that, because the one thing that I'm finding in the work that we're doing is that everybody's got an experience like this. Everybody, whatever level you are of leadership, or even if you're not a formal leader, everybody has that kind of insight. And so, one of the things that I work around, as well as we said, toxicity. And again, it's creating the conditions to have the conversations about why our organizations are toxic. And I've seen lots of research in this area as well, and the impact financially and psychologically and emotionally of living and working in a toxic environment.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we don't like to admit is that a staggering number of leaders that are toxic, are not coachable. And so what do you do with them? I'm compassionate and have empathy to a degree, but what do you do with the leaders that are either condoning and supporting actively, or quietly supporting? And examples of that, you in organizations might have seen this, and other people listening to this might experience this as well, that the boss that comes in and shouts at you, right? That's a very vocal, very, very overt example of toxicity. But then, the meeting before the meeting and you're not invited to it, or the discussion that you need to be at, where you're sidelined in the discussion, or when you hear things like you're in a meeting and you challenge the most senior leader's perspective, because you've got, again, fired leaders, by the way, and the future of leadership. Leaders are driven by a sense of higher purpose, right? Again, but Frederick Laloux calls it the evolutionary purpose. Fired leaders are driven by that something bigger.
Yes.
And they are underpinned by integrity, and they do what they say every time, no exceptions, right? So when they're in a room and they're asked their perspective, because this has happened to me, when I'm asked my perspective on this idea or this product launch or whatever it is, and I give my idea, what I'm then finding is that, there's silence in the room, around the boardroom, because you shouldn't have done that, Paul. You should have deferred to the senior person's view. But again, back to the beginning of the conversation, when I've been personally hired for providing dissenting perspectives, for bringing fresh ideas in, I don't care about the hierarchy or the politics. I care about the idea and how that idea is going to help the organization.
Right.
This is the conversation around toxicity that we have normalized the deviance, and that's a scientific term. We've actually the normalization of deviance is where we've accepted that, Fred just doesn't talk to Julie because, Fred's annoyed that Julie took his budget for the resources he needed. And we've accepted that as normalized leadership team behavior.
Right.
And when you step out from it, you actually realize you've been inside that matrix the whole time. And that's what's happening. A lot of people are starting to realize that and wake up to this. But we're going to be faced with the conversation, which is, what do we do with those leaders that are not coachable?
Right.
How do they get rehabilitated? How do they get exited? How do they learn? Do they want to learn?
Right.
How do they find the courage to look inside and have those difficult conversations? Because, 90% of leaders, I think I mentioned, are not coachable. And yet 87% of people on a webinar recently where I was on with an organization called Leader Factor, out of 7,000 people, 87% had said that they had experienced toxic workplace environments.
I believe it.
Is it any wonder that Gallup's estimating the global cost of disengagement because of toxicity is 7 trillion and rising?
Right. Yeah.
Right. This is the next pandemic.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I do want to give you a chance to highlight your book, the first book of 3. I do want to give you a chance to highlight that a little bit more, but that's a key piece of my book as well, the idea of that connection. That is a key piece, being connected to, as you said, that bigger purpose, the mission, the why. That is so important. And in addition to being connected to leadership and to one another, but that is such a key piece. And so, when you see that there is this upcoming, if we don't do something, epidemic of disengagement, it's not surprising, but it's a scary thought. And again, I think where we need to shift that narrative, shift the paradigm, and do some very intensive work in getting people to, getting leaders especially to rethink that approach. And as you said, one of the key ways for us to do that is to be open to a conversation and be open to dialogue. And one of the things that I talk about a lot, both just in my work, but then also, in these conversations, is that concept of feedback and being willing to give and receive feedback. And I know we've kind of tugged at this thread a little bit throughout this conversation, but I just want to touch on it a little more explicitly. And how does fired leadership and or what you see in terms of the future of leadership development, how does that correspond to cultivating a feedback culture, or just that concept of feedback within the workplace?
Yeah, well, again, I think, couching it in the context of the bigger picture here, I mean, and Marshall Goldsmith writes about this quite eloquently, the idea of feedback. Just think about that, feedback. Yes. I'm looking at you in your behavior backwards. What about feed forward is one of the things he's talked about. Feedback is at a point in time. And so often as part of the process for working on a project with other people or being led or leading other people, or the performance process, the evaluation process, it's a kind of a static one point in time at the end of the year. Now, here's another thing that's going to have my head on a spike by either the learning and development professions or corporates, but again, it's true. Publicly, people may deny this. Privately, they'll be nodding their heads. We all say that we're going to have regular buddy sessions, coaching sessions throughout the year, and we're going to connect and we're going to go for coffee and all that. It's a load of rubbish. We don't do it consistently, because here's what happens. Just like that nice, sponsored school kind of learning and development program you're going to go on, that you're promised as part of your interview and everything, you've got to fit that in around client work. You've got to fit that in around the realities of being a leader in an organization where, you don't clock off at 5 o'clock, right? And you're very often taking your vacations and you're doing work on your laptop while your family's enjoying their time on the beach. The same thing applies for the feedback culture that we have in place at the moment. We don't do it consistently, and we retrofit it to meet the process, right? We're driven by the process rather than the content. So for me, and I talk about this in my book as well, and the work that I do with leadership teams is to make it regular, right? So make it conversational, make it part. Even in my book, one of the things I talk about is like put a time in to talk. Imagine you were my leader, and I was like, right, okay, I'm going to put 15 minutes every Monday to talk to you about feedback. You give me feedback, I give you feedback. break protocol, because that's not what we do now, right? But just impromptu conversation. So regularity, and even Gallup, by the way, in some of their research recently showed that within the last 3 months of their role as a manager, if 50% of those managers surveyed had a performance feedback conversation with their direct manager, they wouldn't have left.
Right.
They wouldn't have left, right? So again, just think about that. So for me, the way feedback permeates in what I'm doing is baking it into the everyday process of being a leader, right? As an individual level, baking it into the team. So if I'm managing a team, having that feedback culture in place and having regular unsolicited feedback. And I use a tool it's called the Jahari Window, which is a 4-quadrant approach to basically being able to spot our blind spots.
Right.
So we all display behaviors that we know about ourselves and others know about us. But as we move through the quadrant, we start to realize that there are behaviors not known to us, but known to others, or not known to others, but known to us. And when we look at those data points in the context of feedback, they can really help shape our roles as humans as well. So I believe that is a key tool to use going forward. And then organizationally, I think too often we just wait for the annual engagement survey.
Right.
Or we're worried that if we provide an idea to that generic email, that HR always manages, so that in itself instills fear.
Right.
How can you put an anonymous email? In fact, why would you even need to put an anonymous email if your one-page laminate talks about trust-based leadership?
Yes.
I don't know. You tell me. So,
honesty, transparency. Yeah.
So what I'm saying, you've got the individual, you've got the team, you've got projects, you've got, as part of the performance process, you've got organizationally. And if, those skipping ahead to the end of this movie will realize that I think our approach to feedback is systemically dysfunctional as well, because we don't, in all of those layers, we are not consistent. And we say we are, again, circling back to the hypocrisy that I'm on a quest to drive forward and talk about. So one of the things for me when I talk about in my work with fired leadership, as well as this creation of a fired leader lab. So this is again a feedback, live real-time feedback environment where, let's say you've got a new project, you specifically drive it through the lab, and the reason you're driving it through the lab is you want those 5 qualities to be used in your ideation solutioning for this service, product, whatever it is. And as part of that, it's a regular process of feedback.
That's great.
And you're seeking feedback on your demonstration of each quality, areas for improvement, enhancement. But I start always from a solutions focused perspective, which means what are you doing that's working? And let's build on that. And almost like an appreciative inquiry context. Because here's the other thing. If I give you feedback and then I rate your performance, some more research I've found recently suggests that A, it reduces your morale, and B, it makes you less productive. And when we eliminate that formal feedback culture and the ratings that go from that, guess what happens? People's performance improves.
Right. Yeah.
So,
it's you've mentioned a couple times the Gallup research, and in at least the most recent version I saw in their State of the American Workforce report, it was there were a couple different stats for feedback, but I think it was around 25, 26%, maybe even a little lower for some of them. People said they had a conversation within the last 6 months with their supervisor about goal setting and attainment, and it was about 20-25% agreed to receiving meaningful feedback from their supervisor, and similar stats that they received feedback that inspired them to do great work. And so, a quarter of the people are saying that they would agree with those statements. But there's other research out there that shows that literally almost everyone wants meaningful feedback, not that rote, yes, I'm going to assign you a number and evaluate your performance, but that meaningful feedback and dialogue that nearly everybody wants at 97%, and they'll fail to be engaged if they don't get it. But you're right, it has to be ongoing and regular. And one of the things that I loved about, and I give the same advice, to set that time, make it sacred, keep that appointment. One of the things I loved in my recent interview with Michael Bungay Stanier, he talked about being more coach-like in our approach. And I loved that because he said it takes this pressure off, this idea that we need to, I agree with you, there should be those regular 15, 20, 30-minute sessions that you have, and you keep that time. But I think often leaders tend to think, oh, okay, well, I have to set aside this huge chunk of time for coaching and to mentor, and I need to set aside an hour each week, for this one person. And he's like, if you just approach each conversation being more coach-like, that really is just, one, it frees you up from this heavy burden of feeling like I need to set aside specific time for coaching, and it brings that curiosity. And I think inherently then those conversations are going to be, like you said, that more meaningful feedback, and that would be motivating and not demotivating.
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of Michael's work, and I've read his The Coaching Habit, I think it's called. And one thing I'd also add to that around the coaching and the mentoring is research I've found shows a high percentage of leaders have never received mentoring or coaching.
Right.
It's a tick box exercise. And I'm one of those guys that came into coaching in the mid 90s. And so I was learning how to be a coach and provide coaching to managers and leaders at a time when coaching was still viewed as punitive. Right. So if you have a coach, you must have done something wrong.
Right.
As opposed to, it's actually an integral part of leadership development and evolution. And so what we found is whilst that paradigm is shifting, which is great, and the industry is getting more regulated, which has its pros and cons, but what we're also finding is that on paper, you're told in the recruitment process you'll get coaching and all this, but in reality, the span of control that your boss has in terms of the number of people he or she oversees means, just like you said, there's an overwhelm, or an expectation. I've got to put an hour in my diary every week for 10 people. By the way, span of control, any more than 9, it's been scientifically shown that you can't actually run a business that way in performance management. So I've worked with executives that have 100, 200 under their purview. So is it any wonder that we're seeing leaders not get coaching or mentoring? And by the way, the other thing, before I kind of wrap that bit up, is when leaders were asked the type of learning that they wanted to receive versus the learning they're getting, they overwhelmingly voted for coaching and mentoring and real world project experience-led learning. The kinds of learning that they're getting are the classroom-based, secondary reading, someone comes in and does a speech. But that's not what leaders want in the future. By the way, that survey was done in 2018. And now we have a rising level of millennial leaders, different modalities, different approaches to feedback and learning. So what would that look like now? I think coaching and mentoring are key to the future here.
Yeah, agreed. Are there other key components as you think about the future of leadership development programming? Are there other key components that you think need to be included? That ongoing coaching and mentoring, are there other key things that we should, have in this paradigm shift?
Yeah. You'd be surprised if I said no.
Yeah, I would. I would say, oh, okay, well then.
Well, that's a wrap. So virtually no leadership development program I've ever seen, reviewed, audited, or whatever I've had the access to has talked about navigating organizational politics or talked about the idea of toxicity or dysfunction. None of them, right? And so why is that? And so we do, however, posit that it's important to be self-aware as a leader, which is great. But we also have a choice once that self-awareness kicks in, and how do we navigate the system? Because we can choose not to. And all the research I've read about politics in the workplace kind of tries to say it's about influence. I don't agree with that, because the context which they start and end their research papers with are, it's a shame we have to play the game of politics when we have such disdain for it. So then as we shift paradigms in the narrative, we have an opportunity in the future to showcase our preference, right? So I think it's time that we start to integrate that kind of modular type learning into our leadership programs. I think one of the other things is, again, 3 data points I mentioned earlier about the nice words of authenticity, transparency, integrity. Until they become grounded in the work that we do as leaders, they're just going to remain buzzwords, lines on a t-shirt, right? They need to seriously be part of the way we learn. And we need to shape our learning processes, infrastructure, whatever you want to call it, in a way where it allows this to come through. And then I talked about this one earlier, but the involvement in the learner, in their learning, from what they learn to how they're assessed to when they learn. And the future is very much going to be anti-plug and play. So, I've got these programs, I'll pick them off the shelf, here you go, leader, to one of, well, what are your priorities? What do you want to learn? And how do we best help you? Because, again, lots of quotes abound by people like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk or others that say, it's not our job to kind of tell people what to do. We need to get smart people, get them to tell us what they want to do and help us run the business. So right. I think involving learners much more proactively. Like, for instance, this is not a novel idea, but I mention it in one of my materials. As you hire a leader, as part of going through that process of getting them on board before they even start with you, ask them what they want to learn. Right? No holds barred, no scripted, no checkbox approach. Ask them what they learn, and then go away and tailor make a plan for that leader.
Right.
That when they come into the orientation and the onboarding is one of the key deliverables that they have had to produce to showcase that they're committed to you.
Yeah.
And use that to converse with your coach and talk about priorities and ratify that. No organization does that.
No. And just think about, how powerful that would be. I mean, that would be amazing. I think not only as a potential future hire or a newly hired individual, would I be amazed at the level of investment that my new employer was willing to make in me, how valuable that would feel that I shared this, you did this for me, and here I am genuinely feeling like I'm part of this team because you've listened to what I had to say and actually taken action on it. And you're from the beginning investing in me. But also, so as the employee, that's amazing. But yes, then think about the impact that would have on the organization if that was the approach that you did. And as you said earlier, aligning what your priorities are as an organization, your leadership priorities, your leadership strategy in alignment with your business strategy, and then seeing how the competencies or whatever area this person wants to learn. I know the competency is kind of a dirty word, but those skills that they want to cultivate, how they can augment and align with that leadership strategy and that business. I mean, that the synergy there is just palpable, and it should be a no-brainer. But you're right, nobody does that.
Yeah, and that's that's shifting the narrative.
Yes.
To have that. And one of the things I write about, which again may have my head on a spike by the HR world, is in my first book, is 13 Unlucky Steps to Leadership Identification, Recruitment, Onboarding and Development. And I go through anecdotal and case study and peer reviewed, all in one, to outline basically what happens when a leader is identified from that initial informal coffee in a coffee shop right the way through to the way that they're developed and then exited from a business. And a lot of people, this is a sneak peek movie trailer here. A lot of people in the HR L&D world aren't going to like it because guess what? It's exposing the way the system has convinced them that they need to be.
Right.
I'm saying it's time for a paradigm shift. It's time to take the blue pill and not the red pill. And the data and the numbers and the future and everything that's coming substantiate that. So, I've had a little bit of fun with that part of my book where I've kind of tongue-in-cheek some stuff and used a bit of sarcasm for those, I'm from the UK, so we have sarcasm, and often North Americans don't really understand my sarcasm, but they'll see enough of it in themselves where they read this and they nod, but publicly they'll probably deny it. Privately, they'll say, that's exactly what happens.
Right.
But until we can have the courage to say in public, the system's broken. No blame, not blaming anyone, but we have such an amazing opportunity to start this again. Right. And it's not even starting it again, it's augmenting what we've got. It's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater and all those euphemisms we could think about this to make it easier to digest for people. Right. It's about having honest conversations, and that's it.
Yeah. No, that's excellent. And I'm fluent in sarcasm, so I think I will absolutely appreciate those components of your book, which I can't wait to read. Yeah. So we are pretty much over our time, but I do want to ask, are there any other key kind of don'ts and do's that we didn't get to cover throughout this conversation that you would like to highlight?
Yeah, I think, do be open-minded, or try to be open-minded. If anyone's listening to this or in a position where they feel they have to go along with the system and it's the way it's always been done, we have to, it's like when you're living, and I'm not comparing this at all to what I'm about to say, but when you're living in a dictatorship, and if people just accept it, nothing will change. It always starts at grassroots. It starts with conversations, organic conversations that lead to a nucleus, which leads to an ecosystem, which leads to a seismic shift. Now, it might be gradual, it might not be, but my one do, if I was suggesting something to someone, is to just try and be open-minded to difference, to thinking differently about thinking differently, right? And also try to stop looking at disruption as a dirty word.
Yeah.
Try to look at disruption as the one currency that will drive your business and your leadership approach forward in these uncertain times that we now have. And let's face it, we've always had uncertainty, but now it's just smacking us in the face, right? The playbook is gone, right? So let's rip up the playbook. Let's be open to having a conversation about what that playbook looks like. That's my kind of do's. And then I guess in terms of don'ts, I wrote a couple here that I wanted to make sure I didn't forget. Don't assume that your whole system needs complete overhaul, right? So this isn't about, again, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's about being open to difference, but don't assume everything is wrong. So look for the synergies, look for where things are working, but also, don't close yourself off to where there is a problem and you don't want to face it. That's very often where the solution is. So I'd say there are my key ones, and I have a lot more in the book because I've taken a very different approach to writing this book, and I give away an end-to-end roadmap of very detailed activities that if someone reads the book and they think, I really like this, I want to do something about it, I've given a set of three different phases of activities that they can pick up and do. And so they don't need me, they don't need anyone to do this for them. And there are some do's and don'ts in there, and some hacks and resources as well that I'm giving away because I want to open source this.
Right. Yeah, that's the best way to reshape that narrative. But that's fantastic. So share with us. Well, first of all, I just need to go back and say that maybe a future book could be that disruption is not a dirty word. That could be a good title, or maybe a blog post title that you could write.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. Often your intellectual property and your intellect there. So I'm doing a bunch of speaking and preparing for different topics, and disruption and reinvention is a key part of what I'm doing. So that's well noted.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So please share with everybody if you're able to at this point, the title of the book and when it's coming out, and also just where people can find you and connect with you.
Yeah, and I know you've written a book, and you've gone through this process, and everyone out there that's written books knows that it's quite a painful process and a time-consuming one. So I'm right at that point where we're finalizing the manuscript. We're going to look at. I've got a literary agent that is going to be pushing out the book proposal to publishers, both traditional or partner publishers, and that in itself, as you know, takes some time. So I think within the next 12 months, the book will come out if I go with the traditional view, traditional publishers. If it's not, if it's the partner publisher route, it probably could be the next 6 months, maybe less. Again, you know exactly what that looks like because you've trodden this path before me. The book title is The Fired Leader, Reinventing the Future of Leadership. And so, again, unless a publisher changes that, that's the title, right?
That's the working title, yeah.
Exactly. Because this is a book about reimagining, rethinking, and reinventing. And so it's a deliberate attempt to showcase the concept, which is the fired leader, and reframe that from being a dirty word as well. Because up until now, Fight Club, we don't talk about Fight Club, but we know it exists. So that's the title.
The number one rule. Yeah,
that's the number one rule. And then in terms of where people can find me, they can find me on all the usual channels. I think LinkedIn under my name is probably better on LinkedIn. Twitter, Clubhouse, Instagram. I'm even on TikTok. Fired Leadership is my handle.
All right, great. And I'll make sure I include those links in the video description as this lives on in YouTube. So wonderful. Well, Paul, thank you so much. This was really a pleasure. I enjoyed this conversation so much. And hopefully your head stays intact and does not end up on a spike anywhere, or maybe that you have 9 lives so that you can continue on.
Yeah, and interestingly, I do a bunch of posts, and I just want to close off with this one. And again, I'm not in any way saying that I am either of these two, but I think I might be the first one at the moment. But when someone comes up with a new idea that isn't tested or isn't embraced, or it's just on the fringes of being accepted and embraced, you're known as a pariah. All of a sudden, when there's a groundswell and people come out of the woodwork and it starts to build, which it is, you're now considered a game changer.
That's right.
Now, I don't like either of those terms, but what I do want to do is have the conversation.
Right.
And I don't really care what you label me as, not you, but people in the world, as long as it leads to a conversation that's forward moving and shifts our narrative, which is exactly why I wanted to come on and talk to you. It's about shifting that paradigm.
Love it.
So thank you for having me and having the courage to have me on this.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you so much. This was fantastic. So, and thank you everyone for tuning in, and we will see you next time. Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.